I would like to thank you all for joining us today for the National Training Conference Performance Management presentation. At the LIHEAP National Training Conference, a team from Apprise presented information on how grantees can review, interpret, and use the data from their performance measures form. This presentation included a way to systematically review and analyze the data you have collected and reported, as well as discussion of resources that the Performance Management Implementation Work Group, also referred to as the PMIWG, has been developing to help states in this process. Since the audience at the national, since the audience at the LIHEAP National Training Conference was diverse and some states were unable to send critical staff, we're now presenting this webinar today to repeat the information presented at the LIHEAP National Training Conference, as well as to provide another opportunity for states to walk through the process of reviewing, interpreting, and using the performance measures data for performance management. So without further ado, I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Melissa Torgerson.
Hi, everyone. This is an abbreviated version of the training that we did at the national conference. And so many of you might know we actually had 3 sessions during the conference, and the first was focused on this PowerPoint, or an extended version of this PowerPoint, where we helped grantees kind of learn to systematically walk through their data. And then we spent time in scenarios and small groups where we gave each small group a state data form and had them kind of go through and walk through the same exercise. So although we won't have the advantage of those small groups, I encourage you to take the information that you learned today and use it in your own form, or use it, we can provide scenarios if you'd like to go walk through that exercise as well. But the goal by the end of this webinar today is that we want grantees to have a kind of a systematic way for walking through their performance data form to look for key client and program characteristics within your data. We want you to all feel more comfortable using LIHEAP performance measure data to answer questions and think about your programs. And we also want you to know what tools and resources are available to help as you kind of implement performance management in your own state. So what we're going to do is walk through this process that you all can use to analyze and interpret your performance measure data. And we're going to use real-life grantee examples. So we've actually taken 2 grantees and put their data, we'll be putting their data on the screen, and we'll be helping you learn how and where to look first. And where to find information. One of the things that we talked about in New Orleans is that as social service providers, we get a lot of flack for using anecdotal evidence or talking about our gut instinct or experience as a way to tell the story of our program. And people are always telling us we need more data, we need more numbers, we need more quantitative evidence. The challenge is, we have this now. We have a good deal of data at our fingertips, but we tend to look at data with our own bias. So you can call it cognitive bias or confirmation bias, but when you begin to analyze data expecting to find something or expecting to affirm something, you can miss a lot of the story that the data is telling you just by sitting on the page. And so that's really one of the things that we want to emphasize today, is that we're going to look at the data head on. We're going to suspend making conclusions until we've seen the data, and then you all can use that information to interpret it with all the program context and knowledge that you have of what's actually happening on the ground. I will underscore that what we're going to walk through is some of the words that people used at the training was overwhelming, tedious, but they also really, by the end of the exercise, really were excited about being able to use this process in their own data and their own state to begin thinking about how to understand their data. So we are going to walk through that process. We're going to outline the tools and resources available, and then at the end, if we have time, we'll share key learning from our training and work with grantees, and those kind of insights are in the slides, whether we get to talk about them or not today. So I do want to start by reminding folks, especially newer people who might be on the call, that LIHEAP performance measures wasn't just something that someone sat in an office and said one day, I think we need these. We have LIHEAP works under mandates that really pushed these forward. The first was you'll notice the first bullet is that HHS is actually required to develop performance goals and measures, and this has been underway for some time. And we're also required by statute to do something within our program which should look familiar because they're the kind of data you're collecting. So for example, we need to be able to report the impact we're having on recipient income eligible households. We're also responsible programmatically to provide the highest level of energy assistance to households that have the highest energy burden. And so that's where for those of you who put the data together, you understand we separate out high burden, we look at burden targeting indices, and this is why we do that. We just wanted to give you a little background. As of January 2000, 41 grantees had submitted performance management data. Many grantees are still working on getting additional vendors to provide data in the performance data form. We also know that grantees are using data from the data warehouse combined with this new performance data to make program decisions, and Apprise is going to continue providing training and technical assistance to improve the amount of data you get as well as the accuracy and reliability of that data. So many of you may have already gotten calls asking you questions about your performance data form to clarify or to make corrections, and that's what this is about. We want to make sure that when you do sit down and begin to interpret your data that you're using the best data possible. So we've talked in the past, and many of you have heard that all of you have kind of a great suite of information available at your fingertips to do performance management. You have the household report, we've had the grantee survey in the past, you have all kinds of program documentation, you have your past LIHEAP state plans and your policy manuals, you have fair hearing transcripts that give you an idea of where things could be improved in your program. There are all kinds of both data that looks like data, numbers, as well as data that may not look like traditional data, like stories and complaints and meeting notes that can be used to inform the design and development of your program. And this new performance measure data kind of just adds to that and gives you some more robust tools to use. And so some of the things that you can get are average annual income by fuel type and energy cost by fuel type. And we get this question a lot from vendors. How does this data vary among, for my particular segment of the population, fuel oil customers or electricity customers, and now we have that data to be able to share with vendors and to use within our offices. We also have things now to actually evaluate impact. So how are we changing the conditions or behaviors or attitudes or knowledge of our households that we're serving? And we know now that we can look at how we're changing their energy burden. How are we adjusting the amount of their income that they're spending on their energy costs? We also have a better understanding of whether we're restoring or preventing home energy, or restoring home energy loss or preventing home energy loss, and how we could potentially do better as a program in increasing prevention over restoration. So we're not so families aren't facing the kind of health and household crises we know can occur with a disconnection. And then we have these targeting indices, and this is what we've talked a lot about over the last 4 years, which looks at how are we complying with the statute? Are we giving greater benefits to higher burden households? And are we reducing their burden at the same level or a higher level than we are average households? And that's what I would like to talk about for just a couple of minutes. I know some of you are new and some of you have asked for a refresher on what are these index things that we see at the bottom of this form that's auto-calculated for us. We're not quite sure what it means. The benefit targeting index tells us whether high burden households receive higher LIHEAP benefits. The burden reduction tells us whether high energy burden have a larger share of their energy bill paid. And so we've put together this example. At the training, we would have two people come up to the front of the room, but I don't have that ability now, so I've kind of drawn pictures. But in this case, you have Jane and Jim. Jane has a $100 energy bill that she brings in, and Jim has a $400 energy bill. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to assume they have the same income and that Jim is the higher burden household. So both Jane and Jim visit their local LIHEAP offices, and when they do, Jane is awarded a $20 LIHEAP benefit. Jim is awarded a $40 LIHEAP benefit. What the benefit targeting index tells us is that Jim obviously received, he's a higher burden household, and he received a higher benefit. And so in this case, the agency who provided these benefits is effectively targeting higher benefits to Jim. And you would see a pretty high benefit targeting index score. But the burden reduction targeting index tells us something different, right? Jane's $20 LIHEAP covered 20% of her energy bill. Even though Jim got twice as much, we only covered 10% of his energy bill. And so we can see that, yes, we're giving higher benefits to Jim, but it's not doing the same thing as Jane's benefit. And so this gives us just a little bit more robust kind of information about how our benefits are impacting different customers. And we see this play out in real data, and some of you have seen this. We've been showing this for the last 4 years, but it's still valuable to look at, especially now that you're doing your own data. This is REX data, so it's national. It's from 2005 and 2009, and what this tells us is that in 2005, on average, people were, both high burden and average households, were getting the same benefit. In 2009, we improved, and you see high burden households getting a $575 benefit and average households getting a $485 benefit. So their index score shows that. But what we see is the same thing in the Jane and Jim example, that even though we're giving slightly higher benefits to high burden households, we're not reducing their burden at the same level. So in 2005, we covered 17% of the bill for average households, but only 13% for high burden. And in 2009, we improved slightly, and we're paying 25% of the bill for average households and 24% of the bill for high burden. So these are the kinds of data that we're going to talk about next as we walk through your own forms. But before we go there, I'd like to see if there are any questions. Are we good, Kevin?
I think so. I think we can move forward, Melissa.
Okay. And I completely forgot to share this. Kevin told me to, and I completely forgot. But in your dialogue screen on the webinar, you'll see that there's a handout. It's a PDF, and that's a copy of these slides. So if any of you would prefer to follow along on paper or want to print these out right afterwards, you can download it right from this dialogue box. So if we move on, we want to, one of the things that even those of us at Apprise have struggled with grantees, and grantees have noted their struggle, is that when you look at that performance data form that you all fill out, first of all, your eyes are drawn to certain places. It's easy to jump all over the place. It can be challenging to figure out what the data is telling you when there's just so much of it to look at. And so we really want to help people systematically walk through the form in a way that helps them pick up key pieces of data that they can then use in a summary to provide to folks for messaging, but also to begin thinking about their programs. This is not, and any of the people that were at the training would tell you, this is not a particularly intuitive process. So we're going to move through 2 examples today. Hopefully you get a little more comfortable, but it really does take repetition and practice. And each time you look at the data, you're going to find something new that you didn't see before. So what we're hoping to do is give you this systematic way of walking through the form in hopes that you will go back to your own data and use it, and give us a call if you need help walking through and interpreting your data. For each example, we're going to walk through the grantee benefit matrix. This gives us some important context about why the data may look the way they do, and also how the data could be used to change that or influence that in future years. We're going to look at the performance data form. We're going to start by looking at all households regardless of fuel type, and then we'll look across fuel types. And then we'll talk about the state performance data snapshot, which we talked about in a previous webinar, but we'll briefly touch on that and how that can help. So we talk about performance management in the past, and on all of you who have done any kind of performance management, whether it be Roma or just logic models or whatever you may have done, know that there are key questions that you should be asking yourself along the way. And so some of the things that we're going to answer as we walk through this, for the benefit matrix, we're going to talk about what factors are used to vary benefits. We're going to talk about whether or not the benefit matrix relies on actual energy expenditures, and we're also going to just go over any other assumptions that the benefit matrix makes. When we move through data for all households, we're going to, I'm not going to read all of these bullets, but we're really going to focus on these 5 areas, and we're going to just answer these 5 questions straight on. And we're going to be looking at the differences in energy bills and income. We're going to be looking at the differences in burden between high burden and average households. And we're going to just ask ourselves at the end, what does this tell me about the benefit matrix potentially? We're also going to do this for a specific main heating fuel next. So that's the number 2 step, same questions. And then we're going to walk across fuel types, because it's what we want to learn is, you know, how are we reducing energy burden regardless of fuel type, and how are we varying the benefit, and is this sufficient? One of the things that you'll see really quickly is that our eyes are immediately drawn to those targeting indices on our form, but you know, one of the big aha moments that we have, that a lot of grantees had at the training, is that doesn't tell you how well you're reducing burden in the first place. So I could be giving Jane a 50-cent benefit, and I could be giving Jim a $100 or a $1 benefit. I know that that's not going to get them anywhere, but those indices are just looking at the relationship between those 2 numbers. So, you know, my indices are going to tell me that I'm not doing such a bad job targeting high burden households, but what good is a dollar doing? It's really not doing any good. So it's very important to look beyond those indices and to look into the data to say, how well am I, you know, what impact am I having on households in terms of getting that energy burden, or the net energy burden, down, and we'll talk about that. So this is example A. We're starting with an example that is pretty, I'm just going to be upfront, these folks are doing a pretty good job. So we're going to start with someone who's in a pretty good spot. This is their benefit matrix. One of my favorite parts of this was that we were able to look at different matrices, which is always insightful if you haven't had an opportunity to do that. In this case, the matrix works by finding the role with the household size, finding the first column that correlates with their income, and then moving up or down that column to household fuel type. And then you multiply the fuel type percentage by last year's fuel cost. So for example, if I was a household of 3 and I had income of $79.28, I'm just going to use an example right off the top, I would move down I'd start on the left-hand side at the number 3, I'd move over to $79.28, and then I'd move down to natural gas. So in the natural gas row, you see that I'm going to have 63.8% of last year's fuel costs paid. That will be my LIHEAP benefit for this year. So this is unique. Folks haven't seen a matrix like this, but the factors used to vary benefits are obviously household size, income, and fuel type. And because this grantee uses the previous year's energy bills, they are relying on energy expenditures. They use it both to determine the client's benefit. They also use it to adjust these percentages for the following year. So they use it in two different ways. If we go through the data systematically on the form, we're going to start with that all households column. It's on the left-hand side of the form. And what we're going to start with is just, this is regardless of fuel type, we're going to look at how annual income compares. So what we see here is that the average annual income of average households is $18,626. The average annual income of high burden households is $7,950. So we can see right offhand that high burden households have an average annual income that's 57% less than average households. Now we look at their energy bill, right, which is the other side of the energy burden equation. You have income over energy costs. And so what we see now is that the average annual energy bill of all households is $2,100 and the average of high burden households is $2,600. So we see energy bills that are 24% greater. What this tells me, by the way, right offhand, if you're starting to kind of put pieces together, is that the difference in energy burden between average households and high burden households is both a result of income and energy costs, but it's more a result of income. So when we look at pre-LIHEAP energy burden, this is before we've helped with LIHEAP, we can see that all households is 11.3 and high burden households is 32.7. And so what this means is that high burden households are paying 2.9 times as much of their income toward energy costs than average households. It's pretty significant. The difference between the average LIHEAP benefit is 43%. So average households are getting $696. High burden households are getting $992. So once again, we're saying, they're paying 2.9 times as much of their income towards energy costs, and we see a 24% greater bill. We see a 43% higher benefit. So how does post-LIHEAP burden? So once we've paid LIHEAP, how have we impacted households? So for average households, we're seeing LIHEAP burden go down to 33%. I'm sorry, forgive me. We're seeing an average reduction percentage-wise of 33.1%, and we're reducing energy burden for high burden households by 38%. So when we start putting all these numbers together, this is where we get that mysterious indices, right? High burden households receive a 43% greater annual LIHEAP benefit than average households, which is why we see that number 143. So we're just trying to take the mystery out of those index numbers by showing you that they really are just about the percentage difference between high burden and average households. On average, high burden households have 15% more of their energy burden covered. So the burden reduction targeting index is 115. So this looks a little busy. This is my, we called it my unicorn slide at the training, trying to find a way to put this all together. And for some of you, this might look different. It should do whatever it takes for you to kind of process information, but this is kind of what I did. And when we start to look at the left-hand side, the three first columns, what we see here is that differences in energy burden between average and high burden households are the result of both higher energy bills and lower income. However, income is a larger factor. We see that in the blue and the yellow boxes. On the right-hand side, we see that high burden households receive higher benefits and have a greater share of their energy burden offset by LIHEAP. With this, just initially, this says to us that the benefit matrix is effectively bearing benefits on income and energy costs. That is what we want to see. We want to see that they're getting a higher benefit. We also would like to see that they're having higher burden households are having a greater share of their energy burden offset with LIHEAP. So we're seeing what we would like here. So we've looked at all households. This is regardless of fuel type, and now we're going to switch over. The second step that we recommend you do is to walk through the fuel type and look at the same information and compare. You know, we saw that for all households that high burden households are getting higher benefits and having a higher amount of their energy burden offset with LIHEAP. Are we seeing that same pattern or similar pattern reflected in each individual fuel type? And so we're going to just walk through natural gas. And once again, this is where people said it seemed tedious at the time until they walked through the exercise. We're just going to answer the same questions. This, once again, makes sure that we're not introducing our own bias into the analysis. We're just looking at the numbers as they are. And what we see here is that for average households, there's an income of $19,000 versus high burden, which is $6,200. So in this case, the income disparity is greater than all households. In natural gas households, we see that high burden households have 67% less income than average. And then when we look at energy bills and how they stack up between average and high burden households, we see actually a little bit less of a disparity than we did in all households. We see that high burden households have 16% greater energy bills than average households. And that's what these circled numbers are. So when we take all of that together, what we see is that for households that have natural gas main heat, the average energy burden before LIHEAP is 9.6%. But for high burden households who heat with natural gas, their pre-LIHEAP burden is 34%. And so what we're seeing is that high burden households are paying 3.5 times as much of their income towards energy costs than average households. And so now we're going to flip over and we're going to say, so how are we varying the benefit to account for this? For average households, the average benefit is $554, and for high burden households, it's $740. So we are, in this case, the grantee is giving 33% higher benefit to high burden households than average households. When we look at that burden reduction, so are we having the same level of impact on high burden natural gas households as we are average? What we see is that high burden natural gas households have 15% more of their energy burden covered with LIHEAP than average. Once again, this is just helping to translate what we're seeing in the numbers to that magic targeting index number. If high burden households get 33% greater annual LIHEAP benefits, you're going to see a targeting index of 133. High burden households also have 15% more of their energy burden covered. You're going to see a targeting index of 115. And here's the unicorn slide again. This just kind of pulls it all together. Once again, we're trying to look at what is the cause of disparity in energy burden. Now, some of you, and I'll be honest, I was one of the first to say, is an energy burden energy burden? Doesn't it just matter that we get it down? Well, when those of you go in to tinker with your benefit matrix to try to improve the numbers that you're seeing here, you need to know whether to take a look at income or just fuel type. And in this case, what we're learning is that for natural gas households, once again, that disparity between average and high burden households is a result of both bills and income, but income is a much larger factor here. High burden households do receive higher benefits and have a greater share of their energy burden offset by LIHEAP. So once again, this suggests that this grantee's benefit matrix is effectively varying benefits among natural gas households. So we're seeing numbers that that we want to see here. They're getting higher benefits and they're having more of their energy burden offset. So the third step when you're looking at your own data is to get out from under those benefit targeting indexes and now begin to look across data. And we're going to look at all households, which is section B. So we're not going to do any comparison with high burden at this point. We're going to focus on just how are you reducing burden for households across different fuel types. And so we're going to look at income, and what we see is that fuel oil, we're comparing to, by the way, for this presentation, natural gas and fuel oil, and what we see is that fuel oil households have less income, about 10% less income than natural gas. We also see a difference in the average energy bills, which many of you probably expect. We know that the average annual energy bill of natural gas main heat households is $1,800, and the average energy bill of fuel oil main heat households is $2,900. So from this data, just looking at it, we can see that fuel oil households have a 58% higher bill. And so then you begin to say, okay, well, so how are our benefits accounting for that? When we look at energy burden, both the result of income and energy costs, we see that natural gas main heat households have a 9.6% burden and fuel oil main heat households have a 16.9%. So we see basically fuel oil households paying 1.75 times more of their income towards energy costs. And we see benefits varied accordingly, right? The average annual LIHEAP benefit for gas main heat households is $554, and the average annual LIHEAP benefit for fuel oil main heat households is $1,176. So we see that the benefit is twice as high for fuel oil than for natural gas, which gets us close to covering, or better than covering, that difference between energy burden in natural gas and fuel oil households. We also know that in addition to getting higher benefits, that fuel oil households here are having more of their energy burden covered. Now, this is something to pay attention to, right? Many states say, you know what, we want to give higher benefits to high burden households, but we also really want to make sure that we're having a relatively equal impact across fuel type. And in this case, what this would tell you is, well, we're having a more significant impact on fuel oil households than we are in natural gas. So fuel oil main heat households have 34% more of their energy burden covered than natural gas main heat households. And that might be a question to ask, you know, why? And honestly, if a vendor were to see this, they may begin asking questions about, well, why are you covering so much more fuel oil? And there may be really good reasons, but it's an important question to ask. So when we pull this together, we see a lot of the same patterns. Households who heat with fuel oil have energy bills that are 58% higher. However, fuel oil households are receiving a LIHEAP benefit that is 112% higher. So you begin to kind of put together pieces and say, okay, why are we giving much higher benefits or having much more of an impact in fuel oil households? The benefit matrix uses actual energy expenditures. So what we see is that people's energy burden is reduced by at least 30% in both natural gas and fuel oil, but the data also shows us that for some fuel types, this reduction is a lot more significant. I want to go back to one thing that we did note in the that we haven't highlighted here. If you look at the energy burden after LIHEAP, so this is the gray column that you see, some people are, when you design your benefit matrix, and this is why it's so important to set goals at the beginning of the program year, some people are going to be looking at the number in the gray column, and some people are going to be looking at the number in the purple column. So for example, some states might say, we want to reduce energy burden by a minimum of 30% for everyone we serve. Some people are going to look at the gray column and say, it's really important to us to have everyone not paying more than 6% of their income on energy. And so for us, it's most important to get that energy burden after LIHEAP for everyone down to 6% or 7% or 10%, whatever it might be. Those are two very different approaches, both completely acceptable, but it will change the way that you look at the data. So you'll notice that when I went through, I immediately focused on this purple column. Are we reducing as much burden for fuel oil or for natural gas as we are for fuel oil? But some people may be looking at the gray box and saying, you know what, I just want to make sure that we're getting people down to a minimum or maximum level of energy burden. And so it's important that you ask yourself, what is it that we're trying to do before you look at these numbers? So if we say, so what? What does all of this tell us? Well, what we do see is on average all households, regardless of fuel type, experience at least a 30% energy burden reduction as a result of LIHEAP. But we also saw that there's some variation there. So fuel oil households see a greater percentage reduction in energy burden, and natural gas see the least reduction. And so there may be some questions there to say, why is this happening? Do actual income and energy costs of LIHEAP align with the benefit matrix? Well, because this matrix relies on actual energy costs, we do see that reflected. So what we'll see in our next example is that actual energy costs are not used, and so we have to pay more attention to, is what we're seeing on the ground actually aligned with what we're using in our matrix? In this case, it's a non-issue. The matrix is based on main heating fuel. However, the data shows a significant amount of total home energy costs are related to electric, and this could be why we're seeing a variation in burden reduction. So one thing that we want to point out is some of you only do main heat benefits and you base your matrix on main heat. But this performance data really looks at total home energy costs, including electricity. So that's something you'll want to pay attention to as you're going through your form and comparing it to your matrix is, does our matrix account for total home energy costs? Or are we really looking at main heating, and that's why our numbers are not coming out as high as we'd like them? Is the state targeting high burden households across all fuel types? And we say yes, it does. And we point out here that we do see some variation among fuel oil households. So LIHEAP benefits reduce energy burden for the average household by over 40%. So in our earlier numbers, you were seeing that if I walk in with a fuel oil bill, I'm going to have 40% of my energy burden reduced. But you'll see in these numbers, there's not a lot of variation between high burden and average households. And it would be hard to get there in this state, because if as an average household I'm going in and having 40% of my energy burden reduced, it's going to be tough to get much higher if I'm a high burden household without paying my whole bill or 60%. And you begin to run into maximum benefit caps. So this is a great example of where the indices cannot be your only thermometer for how well you're doing. In this case, the grantee is covering a huge portion of the fuel oil bill, and to do more for high burden households would break the bank. And so this is a case of taking a look at that more closely and saying, how might we adjust without impacting our customers? Before I take questions, I want to underscore that this, if you're kind of sitting in a fog right now or with your eyes glazed over, that's totally normal. We went through one example. We're going to go through one more, which should make this a little bit more clear. I say a little bit more because this really is something that takes repetition and practice to begin to see patterns and put together conclusions. So I just want to put that out there before we take questions.
Hi, Melissa. Sorry, Melissa, we have two typed in questions, and then I'll let Michelle get to the people whose hands are raised. So the two typed in questions are, the first one is related to the PDF of the presentation slides. If attendees have their menu open for the webinar, there should be a tab called Handouts, and there will be a PDF document located in that tab that you can click on and then get the slides. But we'll also be sending the slides out to attendees after the webinar is finished. The other question that was typed in, Melissa, is about discussing crisis payments and how it might have an impact on average benefits and the resulting data that you see in the form, particularly with a focus on deliverable fuels, where we know that crisis payments can lead to very high total LIHEAP benefits as a result.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've mentioned and that we're going to do some further study on is that a couple of things. First, we're using the matrix as our kind of our baseline to look at how well the matrix addresses high energy burden, average burden households, but we know that the matrix doesn't usually include crisis. So that's the first kind of caveat I want to put on all of this, is that the matrix is the place where most grantees can have the best impact on changing these numbers. But there is the crisis component, which is more discretionary in nature, right? In some states, people aren't looking at energy burden when they look at crisis. They're looking at other external factors and emergencies that may be happening in a household's life, and it will skew the numbers. And so this goes to a really important kind of principle, which is when we look at the impact of LIHEAP, we're looking at the impact of all bill payment assistance, including crisis. But we know that many of you are really, some of you have ratepayer programs that may, complement LIHEAP. Some of you may have crisis that you're using above and beyond what you're trying to do with your standard program. So it's going to impact your numbers, and it does need to be taken into consideration. One of the things that we're recommending, if you have the analytic capacity, you can pull the crisis out and just run your standard benefits and say, if we just look at our regular heating assistance, this is the impact that we're having. When we add the crisis in, we begin to see these changes across different fuel types. And at that point, you can make a decision about, do we want to use our crisis to continue meeting those kind of ad hoc needs, or do we want to fold crisis into this energy burden discussion and really work on using it to lower energy burden or target it more carefully? I'm not sure, that was a very long-winded answer to that question, but the point being that those crisis benefits, when they're not given out as systematically, are going to have an effect on the numbers that you see here.
Thanks, Melissa. Michelle, if you could unmute the attendees who have their hands raised, and we'll address their questions now.
Absolutely. So, Melissa, we have two folks who have raised their hand to ask a question. So the first person that I'm going to unmute is Leslie Ann Lesko. You should be unmuted now, Leslie, to ask your question.
Hello, good afternoon. My question was about the PDF, so that's been answered. Thank you.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Leslie. And then the next person who raised their hand was Lindsay O'Brien. So, Lindsay, I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask your question. You should be unmuted now, Lindsay. Are you there, Lindsay? Okay, well, if not, it's not a problem. Feel free to raise your hand again if you have an additional question, or to type in your question so Kevin can answer it. All right, so those are all the attendees who raised their hand for now, Melissa.
Okay. I'm going to move through the next slides a little bit more quickly, but I want to make sure that you all see what we're, the difference in what we're talking about, and how different data can be, and why it's so important to take time to look through it as it is and let it tell its own story. So in this case, you see a very different benefit matrix. And many states, by the way, use a matrix like this. You have a base level benefit that's pretty static. It's based, you can tell that there's some variation on fuel type. Deliverable fuels seeing a higher benefit than utility, electric and natural gas. You do see a very, some difference for vulnerable households. They get an add-in, and then you also see an add-in for lower income households. And so you can see that the maximum total can vary between fuel type and based on your income and vulnerable status. We go through a lot of the same numbers here, right? So making sure that we understand how the difference in energy burden between average households and high energy burden is the way it is. So in this case, we see that income is 34% less for high burden households than average. And in this case, we see a 48% greater energy bill. So once again, we're seeing differences in energy burden be the result of both income differences and energy bill differences, but we see in this case that energy bills are the greater factor in that variation. We see as a result of those differences that on average annual energy burden for all households before LIHEAP is 6.2. High burden before LIHEAP is 14%. So we see high burden households paying over twice as much. This is kind of right on par with what we're seeing across the United States, where we do see significantly, in some cases, 2 and 3 times as much of their income being paid towards energy. So we turn then and say if they're paying twice as much of their income towards energy and their bills are 43% higher, how much are we varying our benefits to account for that? And in this case, the average annual LIHEAP benefit for all households is $391 and high burden is $417. So high burden households in this case are only getting a benefit that's 26% higher. I'm sorry, $26 higher, 7%. So that $26, we're going to see that kind of come back in that targeting index in a way that shows that we're not able to keep up with the difference in energy burden with just that slight differential. So how does post-LIHEAP burden compare? So once we pay LIHEAP, are we reducing as much of the energy burden for average house or for high burden households as average? And we're seeing that that's not the case here. On average, high burden households have 28% less of their energy burden covered. So this is where we begin to see the targeting indexes change a little. We are giving them a higher benefit. We're giving them a $26 higher benefit, high burden households, and so it's a 7% higher benefit, and you're going to see a targeting index that's above 100. But what we can see is that that $26 doesn't keep up with the variance in income and the variance in energy costs, and so on average, high burden households have 28% less of their energy burden covered. And the 72, by the way, comes from 100 minus 28. So for those of you who are trying to figure out the math. So when we look at this all together, we can begin to make a couple conclusions. We can see once again energy burden is a result of both higher energy bills as well as lower income, but we actually say income is a larger factor, but it's actually energy bills in this case. High burden households have energy bills that are 48% higher than average, but only receive a 7% greater benefit. This is where your brain should start kind of clicking in to say, okay, if we see this much of a difference, how are we accounting for that in our benefit matrix? And so, I mean, the conclusion here is although the grantee is paying a slightly higher benefit to households with lower incomes, it doesn't appear to be enough to address the difference between high burden and average households. So once again, if we look at this new, the gray and the purple column, depending on what your priorities are for your program, what we see is a greater burden reduction for average households than high burden. And we actually also see that if we were trying to get everyone down to a minimum of, say, 6%, we're getting average households down to 4.5, but high burden we're only getting to 11.2. So if you look down at the very last row of colored boxes, you'll see the green. Before LIHEAP, high burden households are paying 2.3% more of their income than average households. When you move over to the gray, after LIHEAP, high burden households are paying 2.5 times more. So we're actually increasing the gap by not giving a high enough benefit or high enough differential to high burden households. We're actually increasing the gap between average and high burden households and the amount of money that they're paying on their energy bill. You know, some of you will need to go back and look at that and to kind of fully take that in, but it's an important number to be thinking about. If we look by main fuel type, we see a lot of the same patterns. High burden households have an average income that's 39% less. We see an energy bill that's 42% greater. So once again, the difference here in energy burden, we see high burden households paying 2.3 times as much of their income, and we know that that disparity is a factor of both energy bill and income, but more energy bill. The difference in benefit, you know, once again, we see that the energy bill is 42% higher. When we get to the difference in benefit, we see that high burden households are only getting a 2% higher benefit, so $8 more than average households. And because of this, when we look at how much we're reducing their energy burden, you're going to see some differences, right? We're reducing average households' energy burden by 26.8%, but we're only reducing high burden households by 19.3%. So we're actually, high burden households have 28% less of their energy burden offset with LIHEAP than average households do. Once again, demystifying those numbers, we see a 2% greater benefit, so the index is going to be 102. We see a 28% less of their energy burden covered. 100 minus 28 is 72. So when we get to this unicorn slide again, we're seeing that some of the same patterns. We see that energy burden is a result more of energy bills than it is income, and we see that even though people have 42% higher energy bills, those high burden households are only getting a 2% greater LIHEAP benefit. And what this tells us is that $25 in additional benefit for low income households doesn't adequately address the disparity of income, and it doesn't account for higher energy bills among high burden households. So we can see from both this example and the previous that high burden households tend to have higher energy bills, and this matrix doesn't account for that. And I'm moving pretty quickly because I know we're running out of time, but if we do the same comparison here across fuel types, we're also going to see some interesting things. We're going to see that between natural gas and fuel oil, incomes are pretty consistent. I mean, there's a negligible difference. We do see a significant difference in energy costs, though. For natural gas, $1,400. For fuel oil, $2,700. So 93% higher energy bills. So the next question is, in our benefit matrix, are we varying benefits enough to account for that? Average energy burden as a result of income and energy bills, 6% versus 11.6%. And now we look at the benefit. So we're getting a little closer with a benefit, with a fuel type differential in this matrix, because we saw, you know, a 93% higher energy cost, and we also see in fuel oil that they're getting a 60% higher benefit. So in this case, the benefit matrix is at least starting to do a better job of accounting for differences in fuel prices. And then when we get down to the average energy burden reduction, we're seeing that natural gas has their energy burden reduced by 26.8% and fuel oil by 22.2%. So once again, for those of you who are saying, we want to reduce burden equally across fuel types, this would be the number that you pay attention to. How can we get these numbers closer together? Especially now knowing what we know about both income and energy costs, how do we tweak our matrix to get these numbers closer together? The unicorn slide here, Fuel oil households have energy bills that are 93% higher than natural gas. However, they only get a 60% greater LIHEAP benefit. I mean, that's just basic. We're just putting on paper what the number is telling us. The matrix grants higher benefits to households with deliverable fuels, but the difference isn't proportionate to actual cost differences. This is where those numbers on the top are so important for those of you who aren't using actual energy costs in your matrices, because looking at the actual fuel costs and then saying, is this reflected? Are the differences in these costs reflected in our matrix? Is a really important question that you can ask yourself right away. So although natural gas households get 60% lower benefits, they still have more of their energy burden reduced than fuel oil households. So what do we take away from this? Average energy burden among all households as a result of LIHEAP ranged from 22 to 35%. So for those of you who are interested in looking at energy burden reduction, you see some variance there, and it would be worth looking at across fuel types what you can see that variance and how do we get those numbers closer together. I will pay attention to, by the way, to this gray box. I keep saying this. A lot of you are interested in what are we getting the energy burden down to with LIHEAP, and you can see here that that when we look at fuel oil and natural gas, we're getting it down to 4.4% burden for natural gas, but only 11% for fuel oil. So if some of you are paying attention to, we want to get everyone to 6%, this would be the column that you would focus on. Does the matrix align with what we're actually seeing happen on the ground? We are seeing that annual oil and propane costs are higher than fuel types, and higher benefits make sense in this matrix. Although the grantees paying $25 more to households with lower income, it's not enough to address the difference between high burden and average households. And there's no variation in the low income add-on benefit between fuel types. So even though high burden electric households receive 79% higher energy bills than average electric, high burden fuel oil households only have 10% higher energy bills. And so it's really important, this is where we talked about looking at each fuel type column, those variances are going to be different, and how does your matrix account for that? I'm going to leave this on the screen. You can see, we talked through these numbers. You can see kind of a wide variance in how much people are able to target. They're slightly targeting higher benefits. We saw $26 and $8, but that's not enough to cover the difference between average burden and high burden households. And so you're seeing those numbers in line E come out a lot lower. Before we go to questions, I know that we're short on time. We did this in 2 hours at the national training, and so we knew this was going to be abbreviated and quick. But I do want to just tell you what's in the rest of these slides. Is that okay, Kevin? I'm assuming that's okay. What we have laid out for you in these slides as you go through them are all of the resources that are available to help you understand this more, to think through it, to use the data that you're seeing. This includes the integration guide we introduced in a webinar. We have customized state snapshots. So we have actual documents that help you pull all this information together in pretty graphs that are easy to understand. And as soon as you get your data cleaned and corrected based on what you've heard back from Apprise, they will generate this for you and send it to you. So that's some incentive to work on your data and get it in and get it corrected. We've listed other tools and resources here to help you think about this. And then we've also listed kind of some aha moments and gone through and explained these. So I encourage you to take a look at them and to look at these with your staff and really think about them as you're going through your data. So I'm going to move to questions.
Melissa, right now it doesn't look like we have any other questions.
Okay. We're happy, we moved through this really quickly. We're happy to sit down with any of you and your staff if you'd like. We can get on a call and walk through this with your own data. We can, or if you want to sit down and try it and then call us when you have questions, please feel free to do so. we're happy to walk through this a little more slowly with you and go through the resources as well. Kevin, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it all.
Okay. Great. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to contact us. Otherwise, thanks for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.